nor do they gather into barns, yet your heavenly God feeds them. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, Jesus later asks, and yet not one of them is forgotten by God? Indeed, in John's Gospel, Jesus describes himself as a good shepherd and notes that a good shepherd lays down his life for his flock of sheep. Dare we conclude that Jesus approves the ultimate act of compassion and love, to die nonviolently, even to protect animals? Jesus embodied nonviolence and compassion. The rest of us are called to follow in his gentle footsteps, yet few have approached him. I think of St. Francis of Assisi, who walked among the poor, preached peace, and in particular loved and celebrated all of creation, including animals. Not to hurt our humble brethren the animals, he said, is our first duty to them, but to stop there is not enough. We have a higher mission, to be of service to them whenever they require it. If you have people who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, he said, you will have people who will deal likewise with other people. Reverend Dr. Lindsay suggests, like St. Francis, that human beings should not act as the master species, but as the servant species. Christ came as a humble servant and called us to love and serve one another, and not to harm anyone. Lindsay suggests that the gospel call to service includes not only selfless service and justice to the poor and oppressed, but also to all creation, including animals. In this way, we become more Christ-like. Many early Christians advocated vegetarianism, including Tertullian, the great advocate of nonviolence, St. John Chrysostom, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and St. Jerome, a doctor of the Church and an early translator of the Bible. The theologian Clement of Alexandria urged Christians to become vegetarians, saying, "It is far better to be happy than to have your bodies act as graveyards for animals." It is clear that for the first 3 centuries after Christ, a Christian could not kill or participate in war. Christians were nonviolent. Some scholars argue that most early Christians were also vegetarians, and that meat eating was not officially allowed until the 4th century, when the Church embraced Constantine and the Roman Empire. Then, just as Christians rejected Jesus' nonviolence and devised the heresy of the so-called just war theory, they deliberately approved meat eating. Regardless of this past practice, though, the question we Christians have to ask ourselves is, how can we become more Christ-like and more faithful to the nonviolent Jesus? Where in our lives could we be more merciful, more compassionate? In our own times, Christians around the world are waking up to the gospel imperative to pursue peace and justice for all people, to reject war, and to practice the active nonviolence of Jesus. They are also rethinking our mistreatment of animals and creation. Many are becoming vegetarians. In 1966, the Vatican newspaper wrote for the first time, "To ill-treat animals and make them suffer without reason is an act of deplorable cruelty to be condemned from a Christian point of view." Other bishops began to include cruelty toward animals under the basic sin of violence. In December of 2000, the Vatican newspaper pointed out that the Catholic Catechism says that it is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. The article went on to question the way animals are raised and killed for food today. Theologian Thomas Berry sums up the growing trend among Christians as follows: "Vegetarianism is a way of life that we should all move toward for economic survival, physical well-being, and spiritual integrity." In other words, one more way we Christians can welcome Christ's reign of nonviolence is by becoming vegetarians. So when we sit down to eat, when we say our grace and invoke the blessing of Jesus, we should also choose to adhere to his life of compassion and nonviolence by maintaining a vegetarian diet. And we know that as we practice mercy to one another and to all God's creatures, we too shall receive mercy and blessings, as Jesus promised in the Beatitudes. Yet the reality today for God's creatures is neither compassionate nor merciful. Our treatment of God's animals is cruel and gruesome. Each year, the United States raises and kills about 9 billion land animals and slaughters another 15 billion sea animals. Laying hens, who are raised for their eggs, spend their entire lives crammed into small, wire mesh cages not much larger than file drawers and stacked in warehouses with tens of thousands of other birds. Conditions are so horrendous that their feet often grow through and around the wire. 1/3 of the birds suffer broken legs on the packed and painful ride to the slaughterhouse, which often entails days without food and water through all weather extremes. One egg represents 34 hours of suffering for a hen, not to mention the ride to the slaughterhouse and slaughter itself. 250 million male birds are suffocated or ground to death. They are useless for the egg industry and are a different strain of bird from those useful for meat. Meanwhile, chickens, pigs, turkeys, dairy cows, and beef cows are genetically bred, fed drugs to make them grow faster, separated from their families at birth, and mutilated without any painkillers. Chickens have their beaks chopped off with a hot blade. Cows and pigs are castrated. Cows have their horns ripped out of the heads. Pigs have their teeth pulled out with pliers and their tails chopped off, and so on. They all suffer the mental and physical anguish of living in tiny spaces with no relief, no ability to act on any of their natural desires and needs, and no hope for escape. They are transported without food or water to a hellish death. Dairy cows and other animals who can no longer walk are dragged from the trucks, breaking more bones in the process. They are killed by being hung upside down and bled to death from a slit throat, often skinned and hacked to bits while still conscious. If slaughterhouses had glass walls, Paul McCartney once said, everyone would go vegetarian. If these farmers, slaughterhouse workers, and truck drivers treated dogs and cats in this manner, they would undoubtedly be prosecuted for animal abuse. It is important to remember also that most animals raised for food are like Frankenstein animals. They have been genetically bred to grow so quickly that their hearts, lungs, and limbs often cannot keep up. Chickens, for example, now grow more than twice as quickly as they did just 30 years ago and are slaughtered before they are even 2 months old. On average, cows give about 4 times as much milk as they would naturally, and many give 10 to 13 times as much milk, their udders literally dragging on the ground. Turkeys have been genetically bred so that they can't even mate naturally anymore. In fact, a few years ago, the Washington Post did a Thanksgiving story about turkeys titled, "Techno Turkey, Serving Up Science for Dinner."
If you are just joining us, we've been hearing Father John Deere lecturing on Christianity and vegetarianism. You're listening to Vegan World Radio on KPFT Pacifica Radio 90.1 FM in Houston, live on the web at kpft.org and archived at our website, veganworldradio.org. I'm Sandy McGee. Show will now resume with Father John Deere on Christianity and vegetarianism. Please stay tuned for announcements of local events at the end of the show.
We are playing Dr. Frankenstein with God's creatures. We are pursuing our demonic addiction to violence with an unimaginable cruelty to not only one another, but to God's creatures as well. Gandhi said you can judge a society by the way it treats its animals, and yet every single day we inflict pain, suffering, and death on millions of God's animals. Tolstoy insisted that vegetarianism is the taproot of humanitarianism. Vegetarianism proves that we're serious about our belief in compassion and justice, that we're mindful of our commitment day in and day out every time we eat. We are reminded of our belief in mercy, and we remind others. We begin to live the nonviolent vision right here and now. Over the centuries, the human race has grown slowly in its awareness of the respect for human rights, including the right to life itself. It is now generally understood that the oppression and exploitation of human beings because of their race, gender, religion, age, and physical ability are unacceptable. As we continue to grow in our moral consciousness, we will learn to abolish war, nuclear weapons, and violence itself. We will also learn to protect the earth and break down the species barrier while embracing our responsibility toward all creatures. Albert Einstein called human bigotry against other species an optical illusion of consciousness. Our task, he said, is to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures. The great humanitarian and theologian Dr. Albert Schweitzer, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, stated, "Compassion, in which all ethics must take root, can only attain its full breadth and depth if it embraces all living creatures and does not limit itself to humankind." Many Christians who agree that harming a dog or cat is wrong think nothing of harming cows, pigs, chickens, fish, and other creatures. We need to understand that if we're eating meat, we are paying people to be cruel to animals. For the simple reason that all animals are creatures beloved by God, and that God created them with a capacity for pain and suffering, we should adopt a vegetarian diet. Another reason for becoming vegetarian is to help protect the environment. Mainstream environmental groups like the Sierra Club, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the World Watch Institute, and the National Audubon Society are drawing attention to the environmental havoc involved in raising animals for food and commercial fishing. In fact, you cannot be a meat-eating environmentalist. It's a contradiction in terms. This only makes sense. Like human beings, animals expend most of their calories simply leading their lives. The harsh reality is that raising animals for food is steadily polluting and depleting our land, water, and air. In the U.S., 20 times as much energy is required to produce a calorie of animal flesh compared to a calorie of vegetable food. We wastefully cycle 70% of all we grow, like soy, corn, wheat, and other grains, through animals, rather than eating these foods directly. Likewise, more than half of all the water used in the U.S. is used to raise animals for food, which is why meat eaters require at least 14 times as much water for their diets as vegetarians. Also, the intensive production of animals for meat requires about 25 times as much land as the production of the same amount of food from vegetable sources. And that's not all. It's not just inefficient to eat animals. The 9 billion land animals that we raise for food in the U.S. excrete 130 times as much waste as the entire human population of the United States. 130 times. And they don't have waste treatment systems for animals. That stuff is swimming with bacteria, hormones, antibiotics, and pesticides. Quite simply, it's toxic waste, and it is the #1 source of water pollution in the United States. Meanwhile, the fishing industry is steadily trashing the world's delicate marine ecosystems. The fishing industry drags drift nets that are miles long along the bottom of the ocean, destroying everything in their path. Factory trawlers are vacuuming the oceans of sea life at an alarming pace. 13 of the 17 major global fisheries are depleted or in serious decline. The other 4 are overexploited or fully exploited. These same trawlers dump unprofitable, often dead animals back into the oceans, along with massive debris and spent fuel. A former cattle rancher named Howard Lyman, now executive director of EarthSave International, urges people to become vegetarians, arguing that, among other things, meat eating is destroying valuable and irreplaceable topsoil. He's the person who was sued, along with Oprah Winfrey, by Texas cattlemen after he discussed the possibility of mad cow disease in the U.S. The jury ruled in his favor. Lyman points out that our soil used to be teeming with life, but now it is lifeless brown dirt. In fact, 85% of topsoil erosion in this country is due to raising animals for food. So if you're reusing bags, using a shower saver, turning off lights when you leave the room, and trying to walk rather than drive,